Good morning. Today we're going to be looking at Jeremiah and the life of Jeremiah. There's a lot of things going on in Jeremiah's life. He's called, and there's some beautiful poetry and beautiful moments of God's covenant love that's revealed. Even some things about the promise ahead with Jesus is in Jeremiah. But through those chapters, there's a lot of hardship. Jeremiah is called the weeping prophet, and we know that there was a lot of hardship in his life, and even the call that he had in his life to speak of God's goodness, but call people back to God when they didn't want anything to do with him was really difficult. He took personal sacrifice for that purpose. Like he was beaten oftentimes. They disregarded him, and one of the prayers we were looking at in chapter 20, actually in that moment he's beaten up basically. Later on in chapter 38 of this, he's thrown into a pit. And like that sludge, gross stuff that I just referred to, I had worked with it when I was back home from college, kind of doing there's a lot of rain, there's a lot of sludge and a lot of gross that we actually cleaned up homes. That was my job, doing construction work, but we did a lot of restoration cleaning because of all the sludge and gross. And you know what I'm talking about, when it gets like crusty and just gross and stinks and it gets just hard to get off your hands and stuff. That's the sort of stuff that Jeremiah, was thrown in a pit or a well that was very deep, and they lowered him down with ropes just to get him down there. And when he's down there, he sinks into the mud, that sludge. They actually left him there. They thought, we're just going to let him starve. There's a siege going on in the city in Jerusalem that he's in right now. And he's calling against the leader saying, hey, we've rejected God. We've said, God, we're going to do our own things. And now God, we're coming to a head now. We need to just surrender to him. This will be an act of faith in God. And by doing that, the restoration began to happen. And they're like, no way. And the worst happened. I mean, they was under siege. It was horrible, the things that happened during that time. And they just kept being stubborn. And Jeremiah is the one that feels like he's got this burden. He has to speak these words. And yet it's so hard because it's difficult, because he keeps getting adverse situations. He's actually becomes oppressed because an injustice has happened to him because he's trying to speak of justice and returning to God. Maybe you've been in those places. Maybe we don't hear that that's prayer sometimes, but that's what's happening. Jeremiah, yes, he listened to God and went down and watched in chapter 18, which is a great chapter, watched how the clay and the potter work together, and God saying, I'm like a potter, and you, Israel, like clay that I work in my hands. Beautiful imagery, right? Beautiful stories and promises about God's covenant and restoration of covenant and putting a new covenant in our hearts in chapter 31. Great promises, awesome. And there's also really difficult times of prayer. In the midst of our lives that are the ebb and flow, we can't mark the moments when our greatest gift and expression of grace will come about, but oftentimes in the midst of difficulty, that's when it comes out. And he's in this life of difficult situations, and especially at the peak, where in 38, he's thrown into this stinky well and left to die for starving. And finally, someone goes on behalf, pulls him out. And pretty soon, actually, the whole Babylonians just basically conquered Jerusalem. And then they do horrible things to him. But Jeremiah is left to live. And Jeremiah is still so much hope, so much promise beyond, but he's got such a difficult situation he's in. And in chapter 20, it does say this. It says that after he'd been beaten up, it says he's really crying out to God in hardship right now. So hear these words. There's really a depression almost going on, but also this place of hope woven in. And maybe we pray that way, but it's very raw. And I want to encourage you today to pray raw. Pray as you are, not as you wish you were. And if you're doing well, great, sing praises. But if you're not, then I want you to pray authentically. Or if there's times in the future where you feel like Jeremiah, wishing you weren't even alive, still pray. He says these words in chapter 20, verse 7, "O Lord, you deceive me. I was deceived. You overpowered me and you prevailed. I am ridiculed all day long. Everyone mocks me. Whenever I speak, I cry out, proclaiming violence and destruction. The word of the Lord has brought me insult and reproach all day long. But if I say I will not mention God or speak any more in God's name, your word is is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. I'm weary from holding it in. Indeed, I can't hold it in. I hear my many whispering, terror on every side. Report him. Let's report him. All my friends are waiting for me to slip, saying, perhaps he will be deceived. Then we will prevail over him, and take our revenge on him. He just basically feels like his friends have abandoned him. God, where are you? But I can't stop doing this because I know it's true. But even though he's in this sense of depression, maybe you've been there. And this is what he says, but the Lord is with me like a mighty warrior. So my persecutors will stumble and not prevail. They will fail and be thoroughly disgraced. Their dishonor will never be forgotten. O Lord Almighty, you who examine the righteous and probe the hearts of the mind. He says basically, stand up for me and against the cause, for the poor and needy. He continually is speaking on God's behalf. And I want to encourage you today, as we look at this text, read, if you want to, chapter 20, read chapter 38. Perhaps you want to read 18 also. But when those places settle in, and I want you to pray from where you are today. And if it's hardship or turmoil, asking God to see his goodness in the midst of it. And if you're praying from a pit, pray for the pit. Pray from that place. And if you're praying from other places, pray from those places. But I want to encourage you today to, in the midst of hardship and maybe even a sense of oppression and depression, that those are legitimate places to pray. We don't have to sanitize our prayers. God will do that for us. We just have to make sure that we open our hearts to God in prayer. We'll see you tomorrow morning.